Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 324. This week the questions are taken from Guide 397 to the Barracuda class submarines of 1921 and the Wednesday video, which is the first in the series on Admiral Spruance. So without further ado, let's get on with questions. BK Zhong asks, has any navy tried to build multiple small warships in one capital-sized drydock? Yes, it has been known to happen, but extremely rarely. Now, that's not necessarily because drydocks aren't capable of doing so. You might think, well, a drydock should be used for maintenance, and yes, that's one of the factors drydocks usually are used for maintenance. But if you think about it, a drydock, which has to be capable of, repairing badly damaged ships, replacing turrets and guns and engines and so forth, therefore usually will have the lifting capacity to bring in any structural elements that are needed to construct a vessel, and instead of sending it down the slipway you can just float it out. Now of course that doesn't necessarily hold true for all drydocks. Some drydocks do have limited craneage capacities and so on and so forth, but it's certainly not impossible to build a ship in a drydock. However, the reason why most of the time a capital ship or other large size dry dock would not be used to build small warships is simply because in practically every country there are vastly more small slipways and dry docks capable of constructing small vessels than there are really big ones that can handle battleships or aircraft carriers. And even small ships take some time to build. And so since you have a limited number of your big dry docks, the last thing you want to do is potentially have a couple of half-built, half-finished ships taking up that space when one of your big ships suddenly gets hit by a torpedo or something and needs critical repairs urgently, and you happen to be the nearest dry dock. So what you tend to find happening in big dry docks, like as can be seen in this picture, is actually more repair work happening to multiple ships at once, because obviously, ships need repairs, and if we can repair multiple ships at once, great. And sometimes, because you're talking about a very large dry dock, that dry dock may actually be the only one in the area that's got the heavy lift equipment capable of making some of the really big repairs that are needed, as opposed to a smaller dry dock which might be able to do more general repairs. So in this particular case, this is in 1944, this is actually a pair of Edsel class destroyer escorts, and one of them, as you can probably guess from the left, has been hit by a torpedo and had its stern blown off, and you can't quite see, but the one on the right has had its bow blown off by a torpedo, and so they're doing an HMS Zubian style, well, we'll trim a little bit off of the back of one, which you can see they've just about done up to a nice neat line, and then we'll trim the remaining bits of the front off the other, join them together, and now we have a fully functional vessel. That's a fairly extreme example, but repair work to multiple ships in a capital grade dry dock, that was more common than just building, because ultimately it's that sort of risk quotient of, yeah, you could build 2, 3, 4 smaller ships in a single dry dock, but you could also just as easily build those ships in smaller dry docks or slipways without running the risk of losing a major capital unit or majorly inconveniencing it, because it needs to wait some time to clear the dry dock if it suddenly needs rapid maintenance. Because this is the thing, with repairs, usually if a ship has made it to the dry dock, that means it is at least to a certain degree capable of staying afloat. So worst case scenario, if a battleship showed up the next day and said, well, you know what, I've got a 60-foot hole in my hull, I need urgent repairs ASAP, you could flood the dry dock and at least tow slightly broken ships out for the minute, and even if they don't go very far, whereas something that's half built just can't be floated. Warrant Officer Will asks, which of the V-boat classes if it could have had its problems fixed, had the most potential, in your opinion? Well, the most conventional answer is probably V7, later USS Dolphin, primarily on the basis that she's essentially the origin point for the development line that eventually leads to the Gatos, Palaus, and Tenches. So clearly she had a huge amount of potential. However, that is more of a continuous line of development from a baseline, just fixing some of the relatively minor issues that Dolphin herself had. While it would give you a useful submarine, doesn't give you a Gato. She's a good starting point for future designs, but in and of herself, the design has a limited amount of capacity. And therefore, my answer in terms of if you took this design, i.e. this hull, this dimensions, and just played around a bit with the internals to try and create a better craft, I would actually say you're looking at V5 and V6, that being the Narwhal and Nautilus. Now, you're not going to necessarily want to make an entire fleet out of them, but despite some initial issues with being quite difficult to dive and quite large and therefore easy to detect, both vessels actually managed to survive the entirety of the Pacific War, and did so despite undertaking over a dozen war patrols each. So clearly there was some upgrading going on in the interwar period anyway with these vessels that, took them from these very clumsy, very vulnerable ships or boats that were described when they initially entered service to, relatively capable ships later on. The main reason why I say they would actually have the greatest potential is, well, sheer size gives you a lot of things to play with. Clearly their diving and sneaking around characteristics could and were improved upon. And with that size, not only comes endurance and greater crew comfort, and as they were used historically, the ability to conduct really specialized operations like landing marine recon parties and recovering them later on and so forth. So kind of spec ops style stuff. But on top of that, you could, if you took the hull as your baseline design, actually configure them to carry quite a lot of torpedoes. Now, granted, at the beginning of the US involvement in World War II, that wouldn't really help, because carrying a lot of malfunctioning torpedoes just means you have more frustration. You're not actually really going to kill much else. But assuming that you have working torpedoes, then having a even bigger than fleet submarine carrying even more torpedoes would actually be quite a useful thing, especially for extremely long-range deep penetration missions, because you're less likely to run out of ammo. You can hang around a lot longer, and that also gives you a lot more options when it comes to evading the Japanese, because of course if you're deep in Japanese held territory, so let's say you have a functioning set of torpedoes in late 42, early 43, and you're right in the core of Japanese held territory, maybe even operating off the Japanese eastern coast of the home islands, well, for most submarines, once the going gets a bit hot, well, after you've sunk a couple of ships and the Japanese come after you, there's a limited number of ways that you can go. The Japanese can probably work that out, stake them out, and they'll probably realize you're fairly low on ammo as well. Whereas with something this size, refitted appropriately, not only could you just go, well, yeah, that's nice, that's what you might think, but actually I'm just going to park myself here in this nice quiet bit I've found and stay here for a week until all you hunting escorts have either gotten bored or run out of fuel yourselves, and then I can leave. And or if I do want to make my way out somewhere, you would be surprised just how many torpedoes I'm still carrying and how much of a problem this could become for you. So, as I said, although I wouldn't necessarily want to build an entire fleet out of them, I think an improved and adapted Narwhal Nautilus style hull could be perhaps a limited production run of a dozen or 2 dozen for the US Navy, with that kind of multi-purpose special forces, extreme long range recon, extreme long range raiding, etc., built in, which would be a useful extra function for the US Navy in the Second World War. Nikujaga Oishi asks, I had a chance to talk to a former anti-submarine warfare officer, and he mentioned that despite the various shortfalls of single-screw designs, they're actually beneficial in terms of acoustic signature, as it'd be relatively more difficult for submarines to identify escorts and distinguish them from merchant ships based on number of shafts alone. While he referred to the Cold War era Knox-class frigates, of which he served, was this also the case for World War II escorts like the Flowers? Yes and no. So, while on the one hand, yes, a lot of merchant ships back in the Second World War, in common with today, would only have a single screw, so having an escort that also had a single screw would initially make it somewhat more difficult to distinguish what was what, as opposed to, that's a twin screw ship, that's almost certainly a frigate. The utility of that from an escort's point of view, or the difficulty in detecting that from a submarine's point of view, I think would be somewhat more limited compared to the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. Partially because, obviously, hydrophones back then, what we today call passive sonar, would be less precise, shorter range, etc., than they are now. And as a result, submarines are less likely to use them to try and specifically identify an enemy ship, more so just, hey, there happens to be noise in that direction, that's probably where the convoy is, let's go have a look. And in aid of that, obviously, a lot more visual detection via periscope was done back in World War II, and at that point, the fact that the Flower class might from certain angles look like the trawler upon which it was based was probably a more helpful in disguising identification than the fact it was a single screw or not. Plus, of course, even if you were using your hydrophones, it should be relatively apparent fairly quickly simply from positioning who is who, because you remember convoys tend to sail in a series of, relatively speaking, close columns. So if you're listening on the hydrophones and you're hearing, okay, well, there's a single screw at this bearing, and then this bearing, this bearing, this bearing, you plot it. That's a fairly regular set of bearings, distances, that's clearly a column of a convoy, and then you plot one or two essentially independently moving single screw vessels some distance away from the convoy. The chances that those are merchant ships that happen to have gone rogue are very small. The chances that they are escorts are considerably higher. But of course, that assumes that you're making extensive use of your hydrophones, which perhaps, later on in the war would be more of a thing as technology improved, and certainly for the Kriegsmarine, at least necessity, came much more of a pressing factor. So overall, I would say a very qualified yes. The fact that it was a single screw vessel based on a civilian design probably meant the Flower class was somewhat harder to pick out in a convoy than a twin screw frigate or a destroyer escort or something like that. But it's going to be much, much less about its acoustic profile in World War II simply because of the, relatively speaking, crude nature of the technology compared to later on. Irina Shidou asks, on the M-class submarines, what would have been feasible retrofits to alleviate the primary issues of the 12-inch gun and make the class at least somewhat viable for the Second World War? Well, as I mentioned in the previous Drydock, the M-class were actually, again, weirdly, given the massive great gun on the top, regarded as pretty decent submarines, all things considered. So, performance-wise, you don't really need to do a huge amount. However, it does need to be emphasized that although these submarines were extremely large submarines for the time period, by World War II, they wouldn't actually be all that large. They'd be bigger than the average sub, but they'd actually be a little bit smaller than a Gato class. But with that in mind, and looking at the plans for them, if I was given the choice of, okay, here's M1 through M3, possibly even, let's say, M4 has been also completed, we're going to turn these into viable conventional subs. Obviously, take off the deck gun. Okay, fine. Maybe we'll stick a more regular 4-inch or 4.7-inch deck gun I would say, aft of the sail. Now, once you've taken that off, that's the huge amount of weight gone, maybe fair in everything as well. But you've also now got the magazines, the hoists, the machinery, etc., which are all pretty much amidships underneath the gun and slightly aft of it, which are now essentially void space. The lowest parts of the magazines I would turn into more stores to make them longer range, so maybe turn half of it into fuel and half of it into dry storage. The upper portion, I would just move everything that's forward aft a bit, so the officers' quarters and officers' wardroom are immediately forward of the gun. In fact, the officer's wardroom is directly under the barrel of the gun. So shove that all back, so it's now right where the magazines and the gun machinery, etc., was before. Then there's auxiliary machinery, some of which is associated with the gun, but most of it is just part of the sub. So move all of that back as well. And yes, this would require fairly extensive refit, but let's face it, we're stripping out the magazines and the main gun. We're doing a fairly extensive refit anyway. Now, the later submarines had, that being M3 and as planned M4, was supposed to have 21-inch torpedo tubes instead of 18-inch tubes, which M1 and M2 had. But essentially what I've done is transfer all the empty volume that was where the gun was and its associated stuff to being just after what is currently the torpedo room. If possible, I would see about maybe sticking another pair of torpedo tubes in there, because they've only got 4. And I think there's probably just enough space if you play around with things a bit to have 6 tubes up front. That would be ideal. If not, then stick a couple of external tubes, a bit like the T-class would later have above, so you at least have 1 6 torpedo salvo. But now, by extending the available space up front, I've created a lot more space for torpedo storage. So whether we have 4 tubes, 6 tubes, or 4 tubes and 2 single shots, whatever, I can carry an awful lot more torpedoes now, and therefore I would load it up. So I've got a bit more fuel, a bit more stores. I've still retained what for a British sub is still very extensive facilities, and I now have quite a lot of torpedoes. So essentially I've created a kind of proto not quite fleet submarine, because it's not going to have the speed to keep up with the battle fleet. It's more of a torpedo cruiser submarine, so it's a extremely long range sub with plenty of stores, plenty of space for the crew, and plenty of ammunition. That would be a very, very handy submarine to have in the Second World War. Wouldn't be particularly useful in the Mediterranean, or indeed fighting the Kriegsmarine for all that matter. But if, bearing in mind we'd only have 3 or 4 of them, if they were sent over to the Pacific, and they almost certainly would have been in the late 1930s if they'd been so refitted, and then whoever's in charge of pulling all the Royal Navy submarines back had looked at them and gone, yeah, okay, the T-class we can get a use for, but honestly, these really big, for the Royal Navy, submarines, probably not, and there's only a few of them, so we'll let them hang around in Singapore for a bit. So when the Japanese declare war, obviously they'll need to leave Singapore in fairly short order, but it would mean that there would be 3 or 4 extremely long range, extremely high capacity ammunition-wise submarines able to go hunting the Japanese fleet in early 1942 with lots and lots of working torpedoes. Vicky asks, why did the Porters and Somerses use single-purpose 5-inch 38s rather than a quick-firing version of the 5-inch 51, given the 5-inch 38's inferior long-range ballistics against surface targets, and the lack of the need for a surface action-only turret to elevate and train anywhere near as rapidly as a dual-purpose turret, which would greatly reduce the severity of need to minimise the turret's rotational inertia by using shorter gun barrels. There's a few reasons. The 5-inch 51 is already a quick-firing gun in the more general sense. It doesn't have anywhere close to the fire rate of the 5-inch 38, but very little does. So modifying it to increase its rate of fire might be possible, but it's still going to be at a disadvantage compared to the 5-inch 38-4 rate of fire. Another problem is that apart from one type of anti-aircraft shell, which obviously as single use isn't going to matter. The 5-inch 51 only uses ammunition that is different from that on the 5-inch 38. So if you're standardizing your secondaries and your new destroyers on the 5-inch 38, it would mean that your destroyer leaders are in the unenviable position of needing a completely different ammunition supply chain, which is going to make logistics an utter pain. And then probably the single most important factor is weight, because each 5-inch 51 gun weighs more than twice what a 5-inch 38 does. Now, granted, that's only a 2.5 to 3 ton weight difference, but multiply it across the 8 guns that you're talking about, and that's 20 to 30 tons just for the guns, let alone any other differences due to what you might have to do in terms of stronger mountings and so on and so forth. Now, that might not sound like a huge amount, but that's actually around about 1.5%, give or take a couple of 0.1%, of the total displacement of the ship, and it's all weight that's relatively high up in the ship. That's actually quite a significant problem. So even if you dropped 2 guns and you said, okay, we're going to have 6 guns in 3 twin mounts, I mean, that still gives you 1 more gun than most of the other destroyers, possibly 2 more guns than some. You're still actually looking at being a little bit more overweight compared to having 8 5-inch 38s. And that's without all the stability issues from, as I said, having all that weight up high. So essentially, that's the single largest reason why they didn't just go with 5-inch 51s for the surface fire only mountings. Radishing Lad asks, I wanted to ask a question on armaments in the Age of Sail. Would a ship in the Napoleonic era have all of its cannon sourced from the same, or perhaps several foundries, making artillery, or was it simply grab at whatever they happened to have in stock or was being produced? Obviously, there's no real interchangeable parts system yet, but was there some attempt at standardization of a ship's cannon? It changes a little bit during the course of a ship's lifetime, so generally speaking, when a ship was launched, especially a capital unit, i.e. a first rate, and to a certain extent second and third rates, they would try to get a uniform armament, i.e. all these guns have been manufactured in approximately the same time by specific set foundries. But that was largely just for neatness' sake and also prestige for the big ships. Especially for the smaller ships, if that wasn't possible, they weren't particularly worried. However, as a ship's lifetime went on, every time it came into dock for a major paying off and refit or whatever, the ship's armament would be landed. That's why at Portsmouth you have gun wharf quays. That's where ships would offload their armament before heading off into ordinary refit, etc., etc. At which point, the guns would just be added to the pile. It wouldn't be a case of, well, these guns are from the Victory, and these guns are from the Courageous, and these guns are from the Ackerton, etc., etc. It would just be, well, here's a pile of 12-pounders, here's a pile of 24-pounders, here's a pile of 32-pounders, and the only exceptions to that would be ships with very unique armaments. So, for example, Victory's immediate predecessor had bronze 42-pounders, which were extremely rare in the Royal Navy at that point, so those would have been pretty much exclusively for her. So when a ship re-equips, it would be a case of, well, you need 34 32-pounders for your lower gun deck. Well, here's 34 32-pounders that we happen to have on hand. Now, obviously, for the bigger ships, they might make a little bit more of an effort to go, well, these are the ones that are probably in somewhat better condition. But if they only had, let's say, 40, well, then you're getting the 34 best of them, and that's pretty much it. So over time, ships would get more and more of a mixed grab bag of guns in terms of where they had come from and what year they'd been manufactured. However, there was a certain attempt at standardization by standardization of shot weight. So in the Royal Navy, certainly by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the most common guns were the 9, 12, 18, 24, and 32-pounder for the long guns. And so you wouldn't expect to find something odd like a 28-pounder or a 16-pounder, for example. And of course, you'd also have fairly standard locations for them. So the 18-pounder would be the standard armament of a fifth rate, at least until the War of 1812. The 32-pounder would be the standard lower gun deck armament for a ship of the line. And the 24-pounder would go above that, except in cases of more lightly built or older ships. And because there was a fair amount of windage in the bore due to the fact that cannonballs were nowhere near uniform in size or shape, it then meant that it didn't matter too much where exactly a cannon had come from, as long as it actually worked, because whether one gun had a 6.15-inch bore and another gun had a 6.2-inch bore, well, you're more than likely to have that kind of difference in guns made by the same manufacturer anyway. And even if they were from different manufacturers, if the average size of the cannonball was 6 inches, then it just meant slightly more or less wadding, which is something that the gun crews would find out pretty sharpish anyway. Darren Blake asks, could the Imperial Japanese Navy have operated jets from their carrier fleet as it existed? And would they have? Or were they developing carriers that could? So there's two ways of answering the question. If you look at the capabilities of the very first jet takeoff and landings on a carrier, that being a Sea Vampire piloted by Eric Winkle Brown on HMS Ocean, a Colossus-class light fleet carrier at the end of 1945, could that have been replicated on the Japanese carrier fleet as it existed? Yes, absolutely. Bearing in mind that Ocean at the time was a Colossus-class, as mentioned, that's actually a relatively short flight deck compared to something like a Shikaku. So quite a large number of Japanese aircraft carriers would have been physically capable of replicating that feat, operating a Sea Vampire off of it. In terms of the other way of looking at it, did the Japanese have a jet and could it have operated off of their carriers? Well, you have this thing, as you can see on screen. This is not a Japanese Me-262. It's inspired by it, but there are a few key differences. Now, could this thing operate off of a carrier? Well, interestingly enough, it did have folding wings, but that wasn't for carrier operation. That was because they were planning on hiding it in caves and such, and caves usually aren't wide enough to fit full-width jet fighters in them. Well, most of them anyway. So coincidentally, that would mean it would be easier to store and operate on a carrier. The one problem that you might have operating this thing off a carrier, apart from the fact obviously you'd have to modify it with arrestor gear and so on and so forth, is that its thrust to weight ratio is somewhat less than that of the Sea Vampire. So it would need a longer takeoff, or as they experimented with it, rocket assisted takeoff packs, that would also work. Although which decks of which Japanese carriers could stand up to the blast of a rocket-assisted takeoff is another match entirely. But yes, in theory, if the war had continued, it would have been possible to navalize this Japanese jet fighter. So yeah, the Japanese carrier fleet, or at least most of it, the big ones at least, would have been possible to operate jets from in some way, shape or form, had they had access to them and or the war went on longer than it did. Admiral Dan Ryan asks, during the Battle of Manila Bay during the Spanish-American War, why was the gunnery so poor? I'm assuming there was a lack of training, but are there more factors? It wasn't even so much a lack of training, although some more gunnery training might have been useful. It was more just the range, because bear in mind, this battle takes place in 1898. The introduction of proper rangefinders hasn't actually happened in anybody's fleet at this point. There are a few devices present aboard the US fleet made by a chap called Fisk, which are essentially very slightly modified sextants held gangster style, i.e. sideways on, but they are of very limited utility and only really give you a decent estimate of range at rather close distances. So if you're going to engage at anything substantial, they're not really all that useful. And when the Battle of Manila Bay started, partly because the Spanish fleet was in large part stationary, gunnery was opened at about 5,000 yards. The problem with that was that this was about 4 times further than where you could reliably hit anything at that point in time. And as the US fleet basically did sort of a Pac-Man style, get slightly closer and reverse course, and repeated this as it got closer and closer to the Spanish fleet, the majority of the firing was taking place at ranges that were frankly far beyond the capabilities of accurate gunnery at the time. It was only when they got towards the end of those passes at about 2,000 yards that they were beginning to approach the kind of ranges where you could actually hit something with artillery on a moving platform aimed by the human eye, which is essentially Nelsonian battle ranges. And that's the primary reason why most of the shots missed. They were just firing far, far, far too far away. And before anyone starts jumping up and down, yes, I know the Bar and Stroud FA1 and FA2 rangefinders were being produced by the time of the Battle of Manila Bay, and there were some other Fisk-like early prototypes of other devices, but they had very limited range setups, and even the Bar and Stroud ones weren't really all that distributed through fleets. They were still essentially going through testing and acceptance, even in the fleets that were very, very keen on adopting them. So regardless of the fact that a handful of ships all around the planet might have had some aboard in 1898, the fact is the ships at the Battle of Manila Bay, pretty much, apart from the Fisk device, didn't. And that's basically the problem. And I mean, when you think about it, 5,000 yards, you're talking about ranges that would be considered fairly ambitious even at the Battle of Tsushima half a decade later, and that was after pretty much everybody had gotten various first, second, and in some cases even early third generation rangefinders slapped onto their ships. Brendan Buersdorf asks, I was curious if it was possible to run a triple or quadruple expansion engine as part of a turbo-electric drive system. I enjoy thinking about weird propulsion ideas, but this one seemed to actually have some merit since the electric motor is doing the actual driving, and the triple expansion engine can just run at a constant speed and thus give relatively decent fuel savings while eliminating the main issue of triple expansion engines being that you don't want to run them at maximum RPM for long periods. Am I off base, or is this theoretically possible? It is theoretically possible, but it would be an extremely complex and extremely heavy setup, even more so than a traditional turboelectric drive system, for one primary reason, and that is rotation speed. Because bear in mind that when you had double, triple, and later in merchant vessels, quadruple expansion engines, those could generally be connected straight to the propeller shafts, and this was fine. When turbines came around, one of the major downsides of direct drive turbines was that their RPM was far, far, far too high and induced cavitation and all sorts of other problems, and that's why you ended up with reduction gearing. With turboelectric drives, you scrap the reduction gearing, so you save weight. Obviously, you then gain weight with the motors and the generators, but there is it more than offsets the saved weight from losing the reduction gearing, but the losing of the reduction gearing does mitigate the weight issue somewhat. And then the turbines are connected, driving at very high RPM, to the generators to make electricity. So you can perhaps see where I'm going with this, because triple or quadruple vertical expansion engines would have the problem of actually their RPM, especially at more sustainable rates where you don't need to shut the whole thing down after 24 hours, actually being far too low for most generators. I mean, you generate some electricity, but not really a huge useful amount. Certainly not if you want to drive a ship. So you would actually need gearing systems within your compound engine electric drive system, which would obviously make it the single heaviest drive system in terms of power density by weight or even by surface area. But it could be done. Essentially what you'd have to do is stick a upscaling gear system from the engine to the turbines to turn your 60, 70, 80 RPM into a lot more than that to get the generators spun up to a speed where they could generate a useful amount of power, which would then obviously be transferred as electricity to the motors. So yeah, possible, rather overly complex though. And apologies in the background, that was Mini Drac at the other end of the house and one floor down. Cheddar Bacon asks, why was a special fire control computer needed for shore bombardment? Was it due to the lack of an assumption of the target being at sea level and needing a new set of gears to calculate the altitude at which the shells would impact during their arc of shot? Partially the altitude of the target would be a factor because, of course, standard surface-to-surface gunfire control computers on battleships tended to assume that both ships were at, on the sea, which is obviously at sea level. But there were a few other issues. Of course, you have the fact that normally ground targets don't tend to move. So when you're inputting target course, target speed, etc., that is 0. And, well, under certain circumstances, you could end up locking up a more traditional fire control computer with literal divide by 0 errors. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, well, how does that work out for shooting at ships in harbour, Mers el Kabir, Battle of Casablanca, etc., or a ship that's dead in the water? Yeah, this is something of a problem. However, it depends on exactly what you're trying to do. It's not a case of, we've told it that the target speed and bearing is 0, therefore it's automatically going to lock up. But there are situations where that could happen, depending on certain circumstances. Plus, you've also got different inputs for working out how you're getting your target information, because, of course, with a standard computer, you're either manually putting it in or you're receiving it from rangefinders, whether that be optical or radar. Whereas with a ship-to-shore situation, you may not actually have direct line of sight on the target, so you may be having to accept target data from other ways, other input methods. And you've also got a rather simple issue of optimization, because for obvious reasons, you tend to assume that your target will be moving, and therefore the granularity of how your computer is going to calculate data, especially when you're having to cut physical cams and gears for all of this, will tend to be most heavily optimized for what you anticipate battle speeds being, probably above 10 knots, below 40. And you see this with some anti-aircraft fire control systems as well, where either they physically can't process some later war aircraft that are moving too quickly for them if they're older systems, or in some cases their lower bracket for target speed is actually a little bit higher than some particularly old attack aircraft were capable of going down to. And so using a ship-to-ship optimized system, even if it will deal with target course and speed being precisely 0, will still have some issues in that it's just not really optimized for that. Yes, the equations you use to solve all the problems would be the same, but as I said, when you're cutting cams and wheels, etc., you're not going to spend time precisely engineering for every single situation between a target doing nothing and a target doing 100 knots, for example, for the case of ship-to-ship. And so if you decide to build a dedicated ship-to-shore fire computer, not only can you optimize for very specific situations unique to shore bombardment, but also to a certain extent, you can simplify and make the thing cheaper because, of course, you can eliminate the whole point of how fast is the target going and where is it going, because all you need to know is where is it. It's essentially a fixed point about which the ship is moving. Of course, if you're targeting a column of troops or tanks that is moving, then you might want to predict course and speed, but at that point it'd probably just be better to estimate aiming at a fixed point anyway. Gallias of Martinengo asks, Since the decommissioning of the Iowa class, the US Navy hasn't found an alternative platform to replace their shore bombardment capability. Politics of US military acquisitions aside, would it not be practical to build vessels similar to World War I era monitors, since they would be protected by the rest of the fleet when deployed, without the need to outfit them with defences against modern weaponry? It would be possible. I'm not necessarily sure about practical, mostly because monitors in the modern day sense, World War I, World War II, i.e. slow gun platforms designed purely for shore bombardment, are in many ways, to use a modern expression, the ultimate flex of a superior naval power, because in theory, a monitor can engage in a certain amount of self-defensive gunfire. They often have some smaller secondary guns, and in theory, I mean, they've got pretty decent fire control systems, so you could engage with your single turret, the big turret, but they're slow, they're not particularly agile, and, you know, if they're facing something that can shoot back with battleship-grade firepower, in the case of the bigger monitors, then, well, the thing that's shooting back is going to have more guns. And in the case that they're engaging a smaller target, like a cruiser or a destroyer, either the rate of fire on the big guns will be too low, or in the case if they're shooting at a cruiser, the cruiser's rate of fire will be much higher, and it's still only 2 guns, which is going to make for difficult, you know, full of shot spotting and correction, because it's half the size of the salvo that you really want. But the whole point of monitors is that essentially, what, apart from the obviously utility of shooting at things on shore with them without having to use full-scale warships, part of the statement that a monitor provides is, yeah, look at me, I have so many resources, I can build this small flotilla of warships whose sole purpose is to slowly motor up to your coast and start blowing up bits and pieces of coastline that you own, with there being, relatively speaking, nothing you can do about it because I control the rest of the seas. So any threat you might pose is relatively minimal. Now, of course, there were threats from fast attack craft and submarines and so forth, i.e. primarily torpedoes, which is why they were extremely heavily bulged, which was part of the reason they were relatively slow. But still, you know, you're acknowledging a degree of threat, but not a huge amount of one. The problem with trying to replicate that these days would be, can you really guarantee the thing's going to be free of threat? Well, even back then you couldn't, but what is the equivalent of the anti-torpedo bulge these days? Well, the most common thing that's going to be flung at shipping these days is going to be missiles, which means now you would need a self-defense capability, which is a bit of a problem because then cost starts going up, and if you're making a essentially slow shore bombardment vessel, well, it can't be quite as slow as the original World War I monitors. It would at least have to keep up with modern troop and landing transports, even if it doesn't have to hit 30 plus knots. So you could, but I suspect they wouldn't look quite as simple as the old school ones. As I say, you're probably looking at a 20 to 25 knot vessel. You'd obviously have to put some fairly hefty artillery on it, and it would at least need some self-defense missiles, because either long-range VLS cells, which would have a data link to another ship that could provide the radar information if you didn't want to put all the sensors on the monitor, which would obviously increase its cost, or some very basic sensors and short-range point defense weapons. You know, take your pick which one is going to be have more utility versus cost. But on the other hand, I suspect you could probably do this with a minimal manned crew, or potentially even an autonomous platform to a certain degree, which might minimize the risk of losing the thing. But of course, if you're going to have to do a 25 knot ship and you're incorporating missiles of some description and possibly sensors plus a fully automated range finding system and gun loading system, etc., 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 suddenly the cost of these things is starting to go up a fair bit. The Outer Circle asks, a number of German ships in World War II had the famous Atlantic bow retroactively installed, especially the Scharnhorsts. How bad was the seakeeping on them prior to the flaring and additional buoyancy, and what were the hydrodynamic compromises that resulted from both the original and Atlantic versions? Particularly with reference to the Scharnhorsts, Their major problem, and this was a problem actually with a number of other German ships, wasn't so much the sea keeping, although given how stiff the Bismarcks were, that's a little bit debatable. The main issue, especially with the Scharnhorst, was wetness, because they finished dramatically overweight. We're talking 8-9% overweight. And as a result, they had a much lower freeboard than had originally been anticipated, which combined with the original bow shape, which you can see here, to mean that they very, very often took water green over the bows, even if in only mild seas, which of course was something of a problem. This was compounded by the fact that not a lot, but a majority of the Scharnhorst's overweight nature tended to be concentrated forward of its centre of balance, so they tended to not only be just overweight and thus with a reduced freeboard, but also somewhat bow heavy, which contributed to the whole plunging the bow straight into the water thing. Now, interestingly enough, in terms of their ability to roll, that wasn't so much affected. It was more the pitching problem. And some of that obviously is down to the fact that the Scharnhorst were the first big capital ships the Germans had tried to design and build since the end of the First World War, because really the Deutschlands are basically just a variant on the heavy cruiser idea. But the Scharnhorst also had the same kind of inherent issue that a lot of the German capital ships would have in the First World War. So this is more of just a general inherent design trait in German major warships rather than something that was a problem with them specifically. And that was the fact they tended to lose speed and roll very heavily when they made a hard turn, which, as I mentioned in other dry docks, did cause some rather interesting perceptions combined with prematurely exploding shells at Jutland when they were being fired on. But nonetheless, the primary difference between having the kind of bow you see here and the Atlantic bow later on is that as the bow flares, obviously there is more volume internally to the bow, therefore there is more buoyancy, therefore as the ship's bow plunges, it provides more and more resistance against continuing to plunge, which hopefully should either slow down or stop the plunge before a more knife-like bow like you see here would, potentially just keep going and you'd end up with green water over the bow. The flip side to that, of course, is that a flared bow does provide a little bit more weight, so there's a bit more inertia going down, but hopefully the flare will more than compensate for that. The other benefit of a Atlantic or flared bow is, of course, not only is there buoyancy, but as it's flaring out, there's a bit more actual resistance, as you can imagine with this kind of bow, although there is a little bit of flare as it progresses back. Once that thing starts dropping through the water, there's not really a huge amount of resistance other than basic friction in the direction of travel to slow down that plunge, whereas with the Atlantic bow, that flare will be slapping the water, which will provide a bit more resistance as well. So in the milder sea conditions, where the Scharnhorst was still experiencing problems with their original bow, the Atlantic bow was a fairly good solution because it kept the tip of the ship out of the water, thus mitigating both the issues with sea coming across the top decks and potentially interfering with guns, and also the slowing and stability effects that would be had, as in bad stability effects, of having a couple of 100 tons of water that high up on the ship. The flip side to it, of course, is that in really heavy sea conditions, the ship was still somewhat forward weighted and still had a relatively low freeboard. So in heavier sea conditions, they would still dig their noses into the water. And when that happened, then obviously you'd get a bit more of a slamming motion rather than just a swift cut in and cut out motion because of that flare. But also it increases the area of the deck, the uppermost deck, which means that when that bow comes up, it's going to scoop a lot more water with it. So you're getting back something in the milder conditions, but you're actually sacrificing both speed and stability in the really bad conditions, and with that a certain amount of operational capability for your forward turrets. So with the bow in the way that it was initially, both forward turrets could very quickly become non-operational if it was steaming at high speed in moderate to high seas, whereas once the Atlantic bow was fitted, a turret, Anton turret, i.e. the forwardmost turret, which not only is foremost but it's also the lowest of the two, that still had some problems as the seas began to build, but Bruno, or B turret, that was actually now pretty much high and dry for most conditions, with some notable exceptions, like, say, the action off Lofoten. In fact, the action off Lofoten is probably one of the best contrasts in terms of freeboard pitching, etc., between a ship that was very good at that, i.e. HMS Renown, and a pair of ships that were pretty bad at it, i.e. the Scharnhorst, even with the Atlantic bows. Now, granted, the direction the ships were steaming in relative to the wind and the waves didn't really help the Scharnhorst much either, but when you have Renown pretty much able to maintain fire with its 15-inch guns and score hits, and its only significant damage being that it went a little bit too fast, a bit too enthusiastically, and ended up ripping off part of its anti-torpedo bulge, which, after all, was an aftermarket addition. Whereas the Scharnhorst were having such bad problems at one point that the water was coming over in such quantities that not only were the guns in danger of potentially being swamped, if they were not at high enough elevation when the waves came rolling over, but also the brass cartridges from the guns were being slammed back into the turrets rather than being nicely expended. It's pretty much a good contrast in the seakeeping of the two types. Daniel Silverthorne asks, what is, to you, the least interesting or most tedious topic that the channel has or will ever cover? And why do you think it would be so uninteresting or tedious? I think for me there are two possible entries into this category, one of which is not all alternate history questions, but alternate histories which are essentially kind of, well, what if the side that won historically won harder? You know, to me that is thoroughly uninteresting, because essentially it's not really coming up with anything new. It's not answering any particularly interesting questions. It's not even really changing the outcome of the battle all that much. All it's doing is beating the side that lost into the ground even harder than they already did. Now, of course, there are some battles where things could have gone either way, and maybe one side eked out a victory somehow, or maybe it's still debated who exactly won, and looking at those can be interesting. But something like, the Battle of Midway, but what if they'd had Avengers and Helldivers instead of Dauntlesses and Devastators? It really doesn't do anything for me. Where the other entry would be some large-scale naval battles, because some large-scale battles, like actually Jutland and Trafalgar, both still have quite a lot of myths around them, or there's a lot of just flat out incorrect information in a lot of videos that are done about them. So doing something where you dig deep into the research and essentially correct those, but not by specifically correcting them and saying, hey, well, in this video they said this. You just present the actual narrative as backed up by actual research. That can be fun, but there are some engagements which not only have been done loads and loads and loads and loads of times, but they've been done quite a bit in very high detail, very correctly. And for those, I'm looking at it and going, well, what can I add? Because if the battle has been told essentially correctly, well, I can tell it correctly. But if that's already been done, well, it's essentially you're going to have two narratives that sound very similar, which not only means, well, it's not all that interesting for me, but also you will inevitably get a bunch of people going, you just copied this person. And it's like, no. It's the same thing where you sometimes get people saying, you just copied this web article for this 5-minute guide or something. And I'm sitting there going, no, because if you listen to the details, there are a few slight changes. But if a large portion of the narrative of a 5-minute guide sounds very similar to some article you read somewhere on the web, maybe check what its sources are. Because if it was an article that was actually written by someone who knew what they were doing, then you'll find probably references. So, for example, with some of the guides I've done recently, not that I'm saying anyone was accusing me on those particular guides, but if you look at, say, the Orion class battleship guide, and, okay, yeah, you might find 1 or 2 articles out there that say something very similar to what that 5-minute guide says. But if you look at the bibliographies of that, you'll find that they're probably referencing the books that I've linked in the description, or at least some of them, like Friedman's British Battleships, Burt's British Battleships, Parks's British Battleships, etc., etc. So if we're all using similar references, is it much of a shock that we all said similar things? Not really. That doesn't mean we copied each other. It means we actually all had access to high-quality sources. But given the grief I occasionally get with the odd 5-minute guide, the grief I'd get if I did something like the Battle of Midway or Pearl Harbor, especially Midway, because I can just imagine. I think the channel's called Montemayor. He did a 2-parter, I think it was, on Midway a while ago, nicely animated as well, which is something I can't really do. And I can absolutely guarantee you that if I did a couple of hours on the Battle of Midway, there'd be at least some people sitting there going, you just copied Montemayor's video. How is this? Any additional new research? And I'd be sitting there going, no, it just so happens we both happen to have read Shattered Sword, amongst other sources. Ultimately, if a thing happened, there are only so many ways you can tell the thing accurately before you run out of ways of telling it. So anyway, I think that those would be my 2 entries on least interesting. That's not to say that something like the Battle of Midway or Pearl Harbor is not interesting. It would just be, in terms of producing a video, the reason I haven't for either of those is I'm essentially sitting there going, when can I add something different, something that adds value, something that people haven't done before? So for the Battle of Midway, as I said, it's been told accurately. Okay, great, I can tell it accurately. What am I putting on top of that? Maybe I'll hunt down a couple of people who do really, really nice War Thunder-based animation videos and say to them, look, can you recreate some of the sequences, like the bombing sequences and so forth, using aircraft in War Thunder, for example? Commission them to do that. That, I think, would be potentially adding something to it. Pearl Harbor, for example, at one point I had this idea in my head of, well, I could potentially add something to the good videos on Pearl Harbor, because obviously there are bad videos on both Midway and Pearl Harbor out there. But for the good ones, I could add something to that by getting drone footage of the actual run-ins that the Japanese aircraft would have done. So you can give yourself a Japanese pilot's perspective of going in at Pearl Harbor. Obviously, nowadays Pearl Harbor looks a little bit different, but that would also be an interesting thing of mapping out. So freeze frame, look, this is how it would have looked then from a photo from the time period, and fade out, this is how it looks now. The slight complication with all of that is, of course, the main run-in for the Japanese torpedo bombers on Battleship Row goes directly over what is currently the Pearl Harbor US Naval Base, and I have a distinct feeling I would not survive very long trying to fly a camera drone over the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, which basically means that's not happening in terms of video production unless and until I can get in contact with the US Navy and either get them to give me permission to fly a camera drone over the base, which I doubt is happening anytime soon, or work with them collaboratively in some way, shape or form. I don't know, maybe they stick me in a Black Hawk or something, or a Seahawk more accurately, and we go and film that way. Who knows? Farender Ritter asks, for Royal Navy officers in the age of sail, what were the rules and practices for picking up items during a commissioned voyage or deployment? Could they pick up trade goods, pets, etc., and be allowed to store them on the ship? Could they get married to local women and have their marriage recognised back in Britain? Could they perhaps bring her aboard? It depends on the rank of the officer and the size of ship they're on to a certain degree. So, obviously, if you're not the captain, you'll have less freedom than if you are the captain. But to go through those, let's say, in roughly reverse order. So could you get married to a local woman and have your marriage recognised back in the UK and bring her back to the UK? In theory, yes, this is possible. From a technical and legal perspective, the captain could marry you. You could get married ashore. And at least on the larger vessels, there were certain provisions in the regulations for officers of a high enough rank to bring wives, etc., aboard. But it would somewhat depend on circumstances. So if your ship was assigned prolonged blockade duty, it would be much harder to justify, say, if you pop into Gibraltar and go, hey, I'm going to marry this woman and bring her on board for another 3 months of blockade duty or something like that. That's going to be much, much harder to justify and get the captain to agree to than, say, we're on year 2 of a 3-year deployment to the Western Pacific as kind of peacetime anti-piracy patrols, and we spent 3 months in a port refitting and I happen to have fallen in love with a local. That kind of thing would be a lot easier to sort out. And of course, if you are the captain, well, you ask your own permission in those circumstances. Oh, yes, I'm going to give myself permission. Great, fantastic. The bigger issue with that situation would be what social convention would say when you got home, which would depend very much in the classic age of sail in the UK of who this person was, where did they come from, what religion were they? If, for example, you'd, in, say, 1760, gotten married to an American woman, someone from the 13 colonies, and came back and they were a good Protestant woman, no one's particularly going to care that much. Whereas if you'd been perhaps involved in Nelson's somewhat abortive attempt to be a land general in Italy and rocked back up in the UK after the collapse of that Neapolitan campaign with, say, a Catholic Italian woman, that would have somewhat different and more negative connotations in the age of sail UK, mostly because of the Catholic part. Could you bring trade goods, pets, etc., and be allowed to store them on the ship? Pets, again, if you were high enough up the rank of officers, yes, to a certain degree, depending on their size. You pick up a parrot or something like that. As long as the captain's not a complete killjoy, nobody's really going to care. Don't try and pick up a monitor lizard or a Komodo dragon or something like that. Also, larger pets do have a distressing habit of getting chucked overboard in the run-up to battle. So, yeah, if you want it to survive, you want it to be small. And ideally, not prone to hurling itself overboard into the sea. Trade goods, no. Now, some illicit trade did happen, but there were pretty strong restrictions against using the king or queen's ships for personal enrichment on the side by basically turning them into glorified cargo vessels. Again, there's a small grey areas involved here. If you happened to be in, say, the Dutch East Indies, and you happened to pay some of your own money to pick up a small chest of spices, which you kept in your cabin and didn't bother anyone about, and then you just happened to sell them on once you were ashore again back in the UK, that's one thing. If you went on temporary shore leave and rocked up alongside the ship with, 200 barrels of fine wine from some random colony somewhere and demanded that the crew load them on board so that you could sell them when you got back home, and they were going to displace the ballast and so forth, yeah, you're not getting away with that. And finally for this week, AB Coates asks, how useful were the float planes launched from battleships and cruisers in World War II, especially if there was a carrier nearby? Was there a better way to use the tonnage that these planes and associated handling equipment occupied? The usefulness really depends on the scenario the ship is facing, plus also to a certain extent the time period. So as the war goes on and radar becomes more and more prevalent and more capable, one of the primary roles for aircraft aboard battleships and cruisers, that being gunnery spotting, falls more and more by the wayside. Gunnery spotting is used early on in the war, for example, during the engagement of Graf Spee, but radar's just a lot better for most of those situations, especially obviously in bad weather and at night. Conversely, even as their utility was falling off for use in ship-to-ship engagements, when shore bombardment came about as a primary role of battleships in the latter stages of the war, then onboard aircraft actually became very useful again because, well, the pilots and observers were already trained to spot the fall of artillery, and being associated directly with the ship, they obviously already knew how to communicate with that ship. They had all the radio settings, etc., and you didn't have to bother a carrier for it. So suddenly they became very useful for that particular role, i.e. spotting the fall of shot in shore bombardment missions. Of course, by that point, some ships had already had their aircraft removed and had the hangars and so forth turned into other things, usually, actually, ironically enough, accommodation for the additional crew for things like radar and additional anti-aircraft guns. But for the ships that still had them, they did find a use there. Other scenarios were if you needed spotting in an area that neither visual nor radar spotting, regardless of what time in the war you were at, was needed, then you could use them then. So Warspite's swordfish with float planes was used in the Battle of Narvik because radar wouldn't really have helped at that point because radar doesn't see through rocks. So essentially spotting in confined environments. To a small degree, anti-submarine patrols, because again, they're designed to be long distance, i.e. long endurance, reconnaissance aircraft with the pilots specifically trained in aerial recon. And again, it doesn't really bother the carriers because what are you going to use if you're a carrier? You're not really going to want to use a fighter because a fighter with just the pilot is going to have to concentrate on flying and spotting at the same time. If you can avoid it, don't necessarily use those. And if you're using a strike aircraft, well, that means you're essentially breaking your strike aircraft packages up and burning up engine time and resources just orbiting for something that 99% of the time is not going to see anything. So although carriers, especially escort carriers, could and did do these kinds of things, there was a certain advantage in using the float planes and seaplanes for those roles if they happened to be present on the battleships and cruisers. Another role which they were very good at because of their nature as either small seaplanes or float planes was actually casualty recovery, because the aircraft on aircraft carriers obviously tended to be wheeled. So if a pilot or plane went down nearby, you'd have to hope that a destroyer could get over there, or destroyer escort or something else like that, which could take time, and you might not have enough escorts to feed one out, so on and so forth. Whereas an orbiting small seaplane or float plane would be locally available and could then just drop down out of the sky, assuming the wave conditions weren't too bad, sidle up, pick up the pilot, and recovery much quicker. And that was actually quite an interesting and frequent activity for battleship and cruiser based aircraft that were still around in the closing stages of the Pacific campaign. And in that particular respect, the Walrus, which was the typical scouting aircraft found on a lot of British warships, actually really came into its own at that point, because, as we said, most battleship and cruiser launched aircraft tended to be seaplanes or float planes, so they could only take off or land on the sea or via a catapult if you're taking off, but they'd need to be craned back aboard. The Walrus was an amphibian. It had landing gear, so although it was actually also a seaplane, it could land on dry land or on an aircraft carrier. And so there are a few photos, and I believe even one or two bits of film, which show a Walrus being launched from a cruiser or a battleship, flying around going, there is a pilot in the water, I shall go and pick him up. They pick him up, fly up again, and then they just lower the landing gear, land on the nearby aircraft carrier and go, here, you can have your pilot back. Toodles, and off they'd go back to their home vessel or to go patrol for more stranded aircrew. So, yeah, there were a number of different uses for the aircraft that were still around and hadn't been supplied by radar and so forth, even when there was a carrier nearby, but they were generally not the roles that the aircraft were originally supposed to be there for, which was long-range reconnaissance and spotting in battle, the former of which had largely been taken over by carrier aircraft, and the latter of which had been taken over mostly by radar. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Apologies there at the end. You might have heard very faintly in the background the tones of Mini Drac, who's having a little bit of a tantrum at the moment. Unfortunately, there's only so far I can physically go and so many doors I can physically close, and she has a very healthy set of lungs on her. But nonetheless, tune in next time for another video with hopefully slightly less background information. Bye.